class, and welcome to This Week in Counseling Families. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I'm your instructor for this course. This week, we're going to be just taking a look at the importance of recognizing that family is a term that holds different meanings for different people. It's really shaped by their personal experiences, their cultural background, and their societal norms. So I want you to kind of start off by just thinking a little bit about what does family mean to you? And think about how does that differ from how the term family might mean something for other people. Now, a little bit of an overview for this lecture. As always, I like to start off with a little story to introduce you to some key figure that contributed something along the lines of counseling families and understanding families. And once we've done that, then we'll explore a little bit of the various concepts of family, as well as how there have been historical shifts in what a middle-class family looks like in America and what that means and how that varies based upon historical context and economic impacts. And then we'll look at different Lakota and Dakota trends to do with family and then other views of family from around the world. So that's kind of our outline for today. And to start off with introducing you to a key figure and telling you a little story about that key figure, our person for today is a fellow by the name of John Scanzoni, born in 1935. And he's really kind of an important figure that contributed a lot to recognizing different shifts in family. John Scanzoni is a sociologist who worked during the 1960s through to the 1980s doing predictions on trends within family, and really developed some pioneering theories about family that have really kind of lasted the test of time within family studies now. Of course, he's now retired, professor emeritus at the University of Florida, but he completed his degree, undergrad and PhD in sociology, and I believe he earned his PhD in sociology from the University of Oregon. Anyways, one of he's best known for something called social exchange theory for families. And this idea posits that family relationships, like other social relationships, are really kind of based upon a give and take. It's an exchange of resources. That might be emotional support in exchange for economic contributions, in exchange for social status. And he really kind of argued that families have a function to them. And as society changes, so too do the resources that are exchanged within families, leading to different shifts in family roles and structures. And so understanding families as a social exchange, he looked at the trends in the 1960s and 70s, and he really predicted that traditional family structures characterized by, the male breadwinner and the female homemaker would give way to something more egalitarian as far as arrangements goes. And he really foresaw the increase in dual income households, a rise of divorce rates, and the growing acceptance of diverse family forms, including cohabitation and single parent families. And Scanzoni has also authored a number of books along these lines, and he's really kind of tried to ground them, being a sociologist, in empirical research, combining both theoretical insights with some data analysis to draw some conclusions about what is the future of family. And some of his notable works are things like Sex Roles, Women's Work and Marital Conflict, that was published way back in 1972, and something called Sexual Bond, Rethinking Families in Close Relationships, that was published in the 1980s. So, John Scanzoni someone that promoted the social exchange theory, the idea that families are about an exchange of resources. And when we understand it that way, we can have a pretty accurate picture of how the kind of the role and function that families do play. Whatever you want to say about love and care, there is still an exchange that happens. Now, I want to take a little bit of time and dive into some foundational understandings of what constitutes family, both historically and in contemporary contexts. So we're going to kind of start off by looking at how do we define family from the historical perspective, as well as some contemporary definitions, just so we have some basic vocabulary that we can use as we move forward within this course. So just some basic ideas. First off, as far as the historical perspective goes, traditionally the family has been defined really as a group of individuals that are blood related, or through marriage or adoption. They live together. And in many societies, the family has been seen as the basic unit of social organization. They're the ones that are responsible for the socialization of children, the transmission of culture, and the economic support of its members. Now, in pre-industrial societies, families were often very large and very extended. And so it included not just parents and children, but also grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins living together, or at least living nearby. Now, as far as the contemporary concept, so in the last 150 years or so, the definition of family has become more inclusive and more varied, and this kind of reflects the changes in societal norms and values, largely within North America. So the nuclear family is typically thought of as consisting of two parents and their children living independently from their extended relatives. And so this model has become prevalent in Western societies during the 20th century. Now, when we think in terms of extended family, and so this includes multiple generations living together or maintaining close relationships, that's seen in many Western, non-Western cultures today. And then there's the idea of blended families. And these are families that are reformed through remarriage. And so it combines children from previous relationships into a single household. Then there's the concept of the chosen marriage. And so this would be a concept particular to the Two-Spirit community, the LGBTQ plus community, where individuals form close supportive relationships that fulfill the roles traditionally associated with family, regardless of blood or legal ties. And then there is, of course, single parent families. So this would be the one parent raising one or more children. And so you have a family structure that has become increasingly more common in modern societies. And of course, cohabitation couples. So this would be unmarried partners living together, sometimes with children, sometimes not. And this kind of reflects the changing attitude towards marriage and family life. So a few things to kind of be mindful of in our understanding and thinking of family. One of the first things is the role of socialization and development. Families play a crucial role in the whole socialization process. So it's about teaching children societal norms and values and behaviors. And so part of the function of the family is to provide the emotional and psychological support necessary for individual development. And so understanding family dynamics is essential for professionals that work particularly in addictions or counseling or psychology or social work or human services, as these dynamics often influence an individual's mental health and their well-being. And then there are the different cultural variations of that, because family structure and roles are going to vary widely across different cultures. And this is shaped by factors such as religion and economic conditions and historical context. And so by studying these variations, we can gain insights into how different societies organize and prioritize relationships and how these systems respond to social change. So, for instance, in many African cultures, the concept of family extends beyond the nuclear unit to include extended kin or even community members, reflecting a more communal approach to life. There's also, of course, the historical context. When we look at the history of family dynamics, we really need to understand that time plays a role here. What society does plays a role as to how we define the family, whether that be a hunter-gatherer society or an industrialized society or urbanization or globalization. Each of these different global trends has led to shifts in family roles and family structure. So, for example, the transition from agrarian to industrial economies in Western worlds led to a decline of extended family households and the rise of the nuclear family as the dominant model within America. So the concept of family is really a complex and fluid idea that I want you to kind of be aware of. It isn't something that is fixed for all time. It's really shaped by culture and economics and historical forces. And so as we go through this course, I want you to kind of be mindful of that, because whether you are in America or somewhere else in the world, it's going to depend upon that, but it's also going to depend upon what's the historical context, what's the economic context, what's the cultural context. All of these things are going to play a role. And also, what do people need? What do they need to get out of the relationship? All of that's going to play a part as well. So, something that I always try to kind of help remind people of is, sometimes we get caught in this idea of marriage being holy in some way or sacred in some way. Yes, it's important, but it's important not for some divine reason. It's important because it plays a function for human existence. And I want you to kind of just be mindful of that, to be very practical with things like marriage. So, for example, there are specific functions in marriage. So as we continue to explore the family and its definition, I want us to think in terms of, what does that mean, not just for family, but for marriage as well. Research has really kind of identified 4 primary functions of marriage within society, across cultures and across time. And the first function is the function of sexual regulation. Now, without legal marriage, men have a tendency to fight over women. And this fighting is bad for everyone involved and is bad for the whole of society in particular. So, within this sexual regulation is also the controlling of the spread of diseases that are transmitted only through bodily fluids. So there's some practical guides here. Second, marriage provides a social unit in which children can be raised to an age of maturity where they can survive on their own. Thirdly, marriage is an economic unit because in most societies, males and females are trained for different tasks to provide an overall balance of the provision of needs. And someone needs to provide domestic care of cooking and cleaning and childcare. It's usually a female, doesn't need to be a female. Someone, usually the male, needs to bring in the external resources, whether that be through hunting or through bringing in a paycheck. And fourthly, marriage provides some social ties, both between and within the culture and between cultures and tribal groups. This is a political and economic function that is part of this as well. So when nations or tribes were at war, they would look to a marriage between the tribes as a means to establish peace, because there would be an important tie between the identities of the two groups. So I hope you see that there is a very complex picture just of marriage. And I want you to be very practical about that. Now, I want to take a little bit of time and look at how families have changed, and just through history. So in the late 19th century, American families were typically, and I'm going to say normally or typically because there's always variability, were primarily shaped by agrarian lifestyles and local economies. And this period, often referred to as the pre-industrial area, was really characterized by large extended families who worked together to sustain their households. So if we understand the structures and roles of the economies of families, and how they provided a foundation for what people needed, then we can kind of understand how and why families were that way. They don't always need to be that way. We need to adjust families to meet our needs. So in the late 1800s, there was large extended family households. There was typically multiple generations living together under one roof in close proximity with each other: grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes aunts and uncles and cousins. And they all formed this tightly knit unit. And these extended families were essential for managing the demands of rural life, such as farming and household tasks that required significant amounts of labor. There was also high birth rates. And that was common because you needed lots of workers on the farm, and it was easier to have babies than it was to go out and bring some external resource in. So children were seen as economic assets that contributed to the household economy from a very early age. And this also meant that there was a patriarchal family structure. This kind of family structure meant that usually the male head of the household, usually the father or grandfather, held a place of authority and made decisions over property because it was an agrarian society. And so this kind of reinforces the whole gender roles and labor distribution historically within America, where men had the responsibility for agricultural work like planting and harvesting and maintaining livestock and managing financial matters. And this meant that they were the household head and provider. The woman's role then was to work centered on the home. But it was no less demanding. They had a responsibility for preparing food, gardening, preserving, cooking, clothing production, spinning, weaving, sewing, and child rearing. And so they had the crucial management skills for the household and for budgeting of the household and preparation of goods for sale. And the children's role then was to contribute to the family labor needs. Boys typically would work alongside their father in the fields, and girls would work alongside their mothers with domestic tasks. And children as they grew older, their responsibilities increased, but they caught this as the idea of what families were meant to be. It's not that this is some preordained organization, but this worked for a period of time, particularly where there was subsistence farming. This is the kind of organization that is required for subsistence farming. When cash incomes are rare and families rely upon bartering and trade for commodities, they need to work together in order to gather those commodities and to provide their own goods. It meant relying upon local markets and barter systems and having good sustainment and self-sustainment and being self-sufficient. All of these things were vital, and so there needed to be some strong interdependence with family units in order to cooperate together. And so this kind of basically, because this was a predominant economy in America, this became the dominant view of what a family should be. But remember, there's no magical formula for the family. Because when we get to the 20th century, there became a very marked shift in American society that was driven by industrialization and urbanization. And we don't see that so much around the Sisseton-Wahpeton area, but in many places in America, that became a dramatic shift. There became migration to urban centers. As industries grew, there were these mass migrations from rural areas to cities where factories and manufacturing jobs were abundant. And this migration led to the breakdown of this traditional extended family unit as individuals and nuclear families moved away from their rural homes in search of work. And so the urban living often meant smaller, more isolated family units that were less reliant upon the extended family for economic survival. And so when you have that less reliance, you have a decline of extended family. When you move to the city, the demands of industrial work made it difficult to have extended families living together. And so the nuclear family became the predominant family structure. And this shift also led to a decrease in intergenerational living, because young adults were expected to now move away and live separately from their parents and their grandparents. And so here we have the emergence of what we think of as the nuclear family, where we have men and women, because of this idealized period, men were expected to be the breadwinners working in the factory or some industrialized job, and the woman was responsible for maintaining the house and raising the children. And so this became very dominant within the urban setting, where men were in the workforce. And then there became a bit of a shift, because industrialization created the demand for labor. Men were working in all these jobs, but although the idealized nuclear family had positioned women as homemakers, many women started to enter the workforce as well, particularly in working class families where single income was insufficient. Now, here's something that started to happen is, in the early part of the 20th century, there was lots of child labor. There was children working long hours at factories and mines and mills, but that began to decline. There was a recognition that there was more skill that was needed for labor, so children did not have the knowledge or the skill set in order to fulfill many of these jobs, and so there became an expectation for education. So compulsory education became a core principle. And with that came child labor laws, because there was a recognition that we're not allowing people in society to grow up in a healthy way. So the thing that we need to kind of remember here is that historically there's been this idealization of the nuclear family, but that's just a blip in time. It hasn't always been the nuclear family. There's no preordained reason it needs to be that way. It was based primarily upon economic and social pressures. So when we think of it that way, we can recognize that there are many different ways of doing family. And we see this in America in the 20th century, particularly in the 1930s, because in 1929 we have the stock market crash that lasted throughout the 1930s. And that was a time of real unprecedented economic hardship in America. And so this profoundly affected families, and it altered significantly traditional roles, forcing adaptation and challenging the very fabric of the American life. Because there was widespread unemployment, this whole Great Depression meant that a quarter of the American workforce was jobless at its peak. And so this put a strain not only on family cohesion, but a breakdown of communication and the inability to make basic needs. And so everybody's roles got shifted. Men lost their jobs, so women would seek employment. And sometimes these opportunities were low paying, but the women were also, entering into domestic services, textile manufacturing, and teaching. And so we see teaching become a dominant field for women, which is something that is still present today. There's also this high impact upon family dynamics. And here we also have the rise of the New Deal in America, the Work Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, to offer jobs for men and women. And a lot of internal migration happens during this time as well. So there's some significant shifts that take place. But then we have the war, and the war kind of changes everything, because after World War II, the GIs come back and we have this reconsolidation of the family in a bit of a different way, because now there's the rise of the suburban nuclear family, which is a model that became emblematic of the American dream, where we have this reintegration of soldiers. After World War II, we have these millions of soldiers returning home, eager to resume their civilian life, and the government facilitated this transition through the GI Bill, which provided veterans access to education, housing loans, and job training. And this reasserted the patriarchal norms that had been in place prior to this, and kind of reestablished men as the primary breadwinners and women as encouraged to stay home and focus. And this happened through the 1950s, but because there was an increase in education, and because there was not the economic and societal pressure that there had been for survival because of technology, women's shifting roles were inevitable in not only the workplace, but within the family. And so we have this shift in the 1960s and 70s of women asserting their desire for autonomy and professional fulfillment, which, coinciding with the baby boom, the dramatic birth rate after the World War II and the suburbanization. And in the midst of all of this, we have rise of mass media and television, which really kind of dominated and reinforced some of these ideas of the nuclear family. All of this kind of plays into our idea of what family is. Now, of course, again, we have shifts that take place, because society never stays still, it's never static. And so in the 1960s and 70s, we have the rise of the women's liberation movement and the LGBTQ plus rights movements. So we have the civil rights movements that push to reshape family life for minorities, for women, and for LGBTQ people. And this also coincides, not related to, but coincides with marriage and divorce law being clarified, and the rise of dual income households, and the evolving of gender roles, recognizing that there is no set need of roles to be a certain way, and that it really depends upon the time, the location, the physical context, the technological context. All of that plays a part in this role. And so in the late 20th century, we have another shift that takes place. And that shift has to do with the decline of manufacturing jobs and the rise of the service economy. So the American economy shifted in this transformation, and that significantly shifted again the structure and role of family. There became some family economic instability, and that really kind of put some pressure on women to be more involved in the workplace, and sometimes that meant the rise of stay-at-home fathers. And also meant, because we have this increased interaction between peoples, we have the increase of blended families and the rise of single-parent households, all kind of taking place at the same time. Recognizing that the role that the family used to play for the central survival of an individual was no longer really there. You don't really need family. I mean, family's nice now, but you're not going to necessarily die without it. You have hospitals, you have police, you have societal institutional structures, you have teachers, you have education system. All of these societal roles are being, that used to be just taken up by the family, are now being taken up by government and the society at large. And so it becomes less need for family. Of course, family's still good. It's nice to have it. But as we come into today, now we have the rise of technology. And so there are, because we have these rises in technology and the different shiftings and awareness of the nuances of human existence, we have an increased variety of structural forms within the family. We have cohabitation couples, we have single family, single parent families, we have blended families, we have families with same-sex parents, all of which have been recognized in the legal system. And then we have multi-generational living, because economic pressures seem to be coming back. Some younger families are living with their parents and grandparents because there is not that economic shift that normally takes place, has historically taken place from one generation to the next. The older generation is living longer, they're holding on to their wealth longer. That makes it a little more difficult for the next generation to be able to come in and do their own traditional nuclear family idea. Not that it's bad, it's just different. It's a new, different way of doing family that we need to be mindful of. This plays out in many ways, particularly in things like how many children do you plan on having in your family. That is, again, part of this whole thing that we'll take a look at in just a little bit. Then we have Lakota and Dakota ideas. Traditionally, Dakota was a hunter-gatherer society. It was a semi-nomadic tribal society, and that had its specific need for a kinship structure that helped to manage the different resources that were there. That certainly changed in colonial times, where agriculture was introduced, and then started to change again. And so there's been some great Lakota shifts that have taken place historically, as far as kinship ties are not only, historically was extremely strong, not only with your immediate family, but with a broader network of relatives and clans. That's still something that we see today, but it's really a legacy, so not so much a function of today's society, economic society. And so there are some shifts that are still taking place within the Dakota culture today, having to do with family. And this has to do a lot with technology. It has to do a lot with economic and social changes. There's significant economic and social challenges, high unemployment rate, health disparities, and also a rise in cultural revitalization. But then the question becomes, how do we redefine Dakota culture to meet our modern societal expectations and roles? Because there's a very different way of doing family when you're chasing bison versus when you are living in a technological service-oriented society. And how do we do that? And how do we do it well while still preserving our identity? Now, the reason why I say that is because I'm going to go through again and just kind of give you a sense of different societies and cultures around the world and how they look different based upon their economy. I'm going to start off with the hunter-gatherer society in the Kalahari, the Coon tribe. The Coon tribe in South Africa. When I used to live in South Africa, a lot of my cab drivers were Coon, and it was so fun to hear them visit with each other because they have this clicking and popping sound when they talk in their language. And now, of course, they speak English perfectly well too. But in the Kung tribes in the Kalahari, it was really the setting is what shaped the social structure and the lifestyle, and it was intended to be adaptable and communal. There was communal support. It was subsistence lifestyle where you foraged and hunted, and that required extensive knowledge of the environment, which was passed down from generation to generation. And because of that, things were very egalitarian. There wasn't need for a lot of social structure, so there wasn't a strong social hierarchy. There wasn't anybody that was in charge per se. It was more you took care of each other. And part of that too meant that when you went to raise children, you were not forcing them to go to school. You weren't being really harsh with punishments, so children were rarely punished physically. Instead, socialization really kind of took place where you just hung out with your kids, you spent time with your kids, you gave gentle guidance to your kids, because there wasn't pressure, there wasn't any place to be, because you were just walking through the forest or through the bushland looking for food. And so it was a very slow process, and there wasn't the need to grow up. In fact, wasn't historically uncommon for a Kung child to still be breastfeeding when they're 5 or 6 or 7 years old. Just the way things were. And that is part of that whole hunter-gatherer society, because historically anthropologists recognize that children are not given responsibilities because they're not considered adults to carry out tasks. They are just working alongside everybody else, but it's a very carefree and easy life. As far as my own historical ancestry, I'm from an indigenous identity called Samis, Arctic-based. Reindeer, caribou is what we would follow, and we would live in what's called a lavu, which you might say in Dakota you might call it a teepee, but we called it a lavu. And the idea was that you lived and worked with your extended family. You just kind of walked and visited, and when you sang a song or talked, you weren't really using words, you were just kind of humming along a tune, and so there wasn't a lot of need for societal structure, for being in power, and all of that makes for a very different way of doing family than for what we think of as a modern nuclear family, a technological family. Again, if we look at Chinese societies historically were agrarian, or we can look at 18th century or 19th century America for the same thing. Agrarian families see children as economic assets. So there's a lot of pressure upon them. The physical discipline is tougher. There's higher responsibility for the children. They're viewed as miniature adults, and you have a lot of them. So it wasn't uncommon in this area for farming families to have 7, 8, 10, 12, 15, 18 children, because you needed lots of workers. And that's a very different way of doing family than you would have if you were working at McDonald's and you had a small apartment. You don't want 18 children if you work at McDonald's and have a small apartment. That doesn't help you. So it's a very different way of doing family. And that's why when we get to modern society, what we would call today a technological society, we don't have the need for family to protect us. We have police for that. We have a court system for that. And so children are not seen as an economic asset. They're seen as a luxury item. They're a financial liability. And so a lot of people put off having children for a period of time until they have a career. And if they do have children, they only have one or two children. You see this all around the world. As soon as societies industrialize, let's take China for example. China became such a huge population. Every 1 in 7 people in the world is Chinese. But they became this huge population because they were an agrarian society. They all had a lot of children. And then all of a sudden they became, in this last generation, a technological society. So now most couples aren't having any children, or they're just having one child. And the impact that that's going to have historically on society will be profound. The population is going to contract significantly because now family is seen as a different kind of thing in a technological society. And so that's just something I want you to be mindful of, is what is the economic and social pressures that a person is living in, what do they need, and what is the best model for family in that structure. All of those things, I think, are very important. Is family meeting the needs of its members? That is the mark of a good family. Not, is there a father and a mother, and the mother stays at home and the father's out being a breadwinner. That's not the mark of a good family. Families are to be functional. What are the functions of the family? Are those functions meeting the needs of people? As always, I like to have a few key terms highlighted and question and answer also that is there. So you can see here some of the key terms for today's lecture are, first off, what's a nuclear family? When we think of nuclear family, it's a family group that consists of 2 parents and their children, 1 or more children, living together as a unit. That's kind of the historical post-war American image of an ideal family structure. But remember, it's historically based. Then there's the whole idea of what's an egalitarian family structure, and that's a family system where all family members are treated as equals, with no clear hierarchy that influences roles or responsibilities. So like, for example, the Kun tribe, there is no need for a breadwinner because everybody's walking around getting their own food. So there is no need for a hierarchy in gender roles for decision making, because everything is subsistence activities. And then the idea of the extended family. What do we mean by that? And that is a family that extends beyond the nuclear family, including grandparents and aunts and uncles and other relatives who all play an integral role in daily life. So that's a few things to kind of be mindful of for today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and found it informative. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.